18 years ago this evening, I was writing a very different kind of drasha than the one I'm about to deliver. Because 18 years ago this morning, our son Yaakov Zal was killed in a car accident while serving on staff at Camp Mosheva. And 18 years ago this evening, I was writing his eulogy. Much has happened in the intervening years. More than 10 children were named for him. 2 Batei Medrash, one in Chicago and one at Mosheva, were built in his memory. And Sfarim and spaces have been dedicated to his name. And while I delivered my annual Yortzeit Drasha earlier today, this evening, I want to share with you 2 thoughts. One from the parashah, and one that relates to this time of year, and then a lesson I learned from my eldest son. This week's parashah of Devarim is the beginning of a lengthy farewell address delivered by Moshe Rabbeinu to the Jewish people. It begins with veiled references to their many sins and expands to more direct words of rebuke and musar. But why was it necessary? Didn't these people witness an entire generation of adult Jewish males, 600,000, die in the desert? Wasn't that musar enough? Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu simply speak of his hopes and dreams, practice some positive psychology, bid farewell, and then ascend the mountain to see the land and meet his maker? Why deliver the musar? According to Rabbi Kotler Zatzal, the answer is because it's human nature to get used to things we should never get used to see suffering and tragedy that may have been unimaginable, but after the initial shock, file those images away and move on. How? Because we convince ourselves that the risk is someone else's, that either we're better or we're immune, or it would never happen to us. And then we file those fears away and move on. In Yiddish, they say, "Mir gewinnen sich zum." You get used to things, even things that are horrific, or even as the Midrash described, they got used to seeing an annual event, Tisha B'Av in the desert, when hundreds of thousands of men dug their own graves on the anniversary of the sin of the Meraglim, the spies, and then would lie down in those graves. And each year, 15,000 never got up. Even that they could file away and move on. And so Moshe had to deliver his words of musar, slowly at first, and more explicitly as he moved forward. Because things need to be said, and things need to be learned, and sometimes the obvious is not so obvious, and so the musar had to be given. But when he did, Moshe used some unusual language referring to recent events with terms that made them sound as if they were far away, in a distant past. We inherited the lands of Sichon and Og, Ba'etahi, at that time, he said, even though it happened just a few months before. And when he was referring to the lands of the Transjordan, he noted that there were cities named Chavot Yair, Ad Hayom Hazeh, even though this day, the Yom Hazeh, was so very soon after that day when they were established. Why did Moshe use those historical terms? The answer is because Moshe knew that as much as he was speaking to the people before him, he was also speaking to all of the generations to come. Not only because Torah is eternal, but because the Musar Moshe Rabbeinu chose to give applied then and apply now. Just think of what is happening today as we witness the tragedies associated with the pandemic, dangers of a disease which surround us, and yet people gather and party, protest and parade, because they can file it away and move on. And so along comes the Chumash and its Musar to remind us then and now that we need to be grateful for what God has granted us. And we must be faithful to Torah, and that actions have significance, consequence, and meaning, which is item number 1. And the second point I want to share this evening is about these days, the days leading up to Tisha B'Av, when we will read the words of the Megillah that begins, Echa Yashva Badad. How lonely is the city? In the context of the book of Echa, the word Badad is a sorrowful word that imagines a city that is abandoned and alone. But interestingly, that very same word is also found in Bilam's blessing, Hen Am Levadad Yishkon, that we are a nation that lives alone. And again, in Moshe Rabbeinu's blessing, Vayishkon Yisrael Betach Badad, Israel lives secure and alone. How can Badad be both a curse and a blessing? The answer is simple, but has tremendous meaning, because there are two types of being alone. There is an alone, which is a loneliness that makes everything hurt, makes everything more painful when a person feels alone by himself or herself. It's a loneliness that is an abandonment. But there is another kind of loneliness. It's a loneliness of distinction, of being with others, but not with everyone. It is the loneliness of a couple in love who are oblivious to all others. And it's the loneliness of the Jewish people and our covenants with God. The former is a very sad state, while the latter is a blessing. And the call of Echa is to transform our challenges, the destruction we still mourn, and find ways to rebuild and reconnect, to move from one kind of badad to the other, to find our place among others for the sake of others, and search for higher purpose and meaning. Which brings me back to the lesson I learned from my son, a bit of musar that he left for me that I may have filed away at first and not noticed until he was gone. Yaakov Zal was full of life. He was a Baal Chesed from when he was so very young, bringing extra pennies to nursery, just in case one of the other children forgot to bring their tzedakah, and through his years of helping others. But more than anything else, Yaakov collected people, friends who regaled with him in his antics, and they were not few, and others who were lonely, needed friends, and Yaakov was the great connector. I knew that he had a certain talent, a certain natural gutzkeit. I saw it. Everyone saw it. But only after he passed away did we start hearing the stories and continue to hear them to this very day. which is a blessing in the face of a tragedy. The realization that if he could have had such a profound impact on others in such a short time on this earth, so can we. We only need to try. And it's a blessing that we can, and please God, will continue to transform that existential, deep, deep pain into a light of inspiration through his lessons in our community. The loneliness we felt 18 years ago is now a badad of opportunity and connection. May Yaakov's memory be for a blessing. And may the lessons of Moshe Rabbeinu, the words he spoke and the musar he delivered, continue to inspire us as we face challenges, both those we recognize and those we can't. Shabbat Shalom.